Thanks for joining us today. Today's episode is pretty special because we received our very first request, and the request was about seeing more genetics content. So here it is. Hi guys, my name is Mikey from Avo Prep Academy, and on our channel we discuss a lot of things that pertain to AP biology or just biology in general. So if that's your thing, consider subscribing to our channel so you can stay on top of all the new content that we have coming up. But today's episode is pretty special because we're going to kickstart our genetics series of lectures today. And instead of doing the traditional thing of giving you a dry lecture about how to solve Punnett squares and all that, I figured I can talk a little bit about why I personally believe that Gregor Mendel is one of the smartest people to have ever lived. And in telling that story, we're going to take a narrative approach where we sort of look at things from Mendel's perspectives. So instead of putting everything into context of the modern synthesis with chromosomes and genes and alleles, we can kind of emulate the thinking process of how Mendel would have come up with his theory as well as the laws of Mendelian genetics. Mendel was born in what is now the Czech Republic, but back then it was part of the Austrian Empire. Now he was born to a relatively poor farming family, but I think his parents were able to notice that Mendel was very gifted both mathematically and in the areas of natural science. So his parents were able to somehow get him to university. And I think one of the most important influences that Mendel had while he was studying at the university was a professor who was studying a lot of the traits and characteristics of farm animals like sheep and cow. And from there, after graduating, Mendel would join a monastery. Because at the time, if you're poor and you didn't really have access to a lot of capital, but you wanted to be a scholar, then you can become a monk or a priest and you can live on the monastery while conducting your scientific research. So this was the perfect opportunity for Mendel to begin his studies. Now, we all know Mendel as being this father of genetics and his work on peas. But before we can get to that, we have to sort of think about the context of how people thought about inheritance patterns back in the 19th century. Because here's the thing, it's not that people didn't know that offspring or children tended to look like their parents. If we hadn't known that, we wouldn't have been able to domesticate the crops that we had, or even domesticate dogs, which were integral to people's lives back then as they are today. They're our best friends, of course. So people knew that there was something about individuals that were passed on to the subsequent generations, but the problem was that we didn't know the mechanisms of its action. And that is not that strange to think about, because we all know that jumping off of a bridge is probably not going to be conducive to your well-being, but at the same time, you don't have to know that gravity would accelerate you at 9.8 meters per second squared. So even though we didn't understand the mechanism behind something, it doesn't mean that we didn't know it existed. But of course, people did try to explain the mechanisms of heredity. And that's one of the first things that we'll establish here today in our story. Because in the 19th century, what people believed was a theory called the theory of blended inheritance. And on the surface, it sort of made sense because this theory indicated that children or offspring were simply blends of their parents. And in so many ways, this seemed to make so much sense with our domestication efforts when we look at the organism as a whole. However, this was a theory that Mendel wanted to challenge because he wanted to understand not just about what happened, but how it happened. So here's what Mendel did. He decided that he would work with pea plants because pea plants were easily cultivated and he could control the mechanisms of reproduction by simply doing something called artificial pollination. And he knew that what he wanted to look at was not the whole plant, but specific traits within the plant that he can analyze and see their patterns of inheritance. And this is extremely important because when we compare blended inheritance to the theory that Mendel would create, it really came down to Mendel's specific focus on particular aspects of that pea plant that made, I think, all the difference. So let's just take one of those examples because we know that Mendel looked at things like plant height, plant flower color, he looked at pea pod color, he looked at wrinkled versus smooth seeds, and so on. But maybe for the purpose of this example, we could focus on flower color. Because one of the things that Mendel noticed was that there was these two discrete characteristics of the flower color, whether the pea plants had white flowers or purple flowers. And here's what he did. First thing, he develops what he calls the pure breeding line of white flower plants and pure breeding lines of purple flower plants. And he did this by continuing to cross-pollinate whites and whites, purples and purples, until where he believed that these individuals had whatever it was, the pure essence of that white flower or the pure essence of the purple flower embedded within the organism as a whole. Now, once he had the pure breeding plants, the first thing he did was to cross-pollinate between the white flower variety and the purple flower variety in what he called the P generation, or the parental generation. Now, the results he got were quite shocking because all of the subsequent plants were in fact purple. And this meant that the theory of blended inheritance that most people believed at the time couldn't be true. But what he did next was really important because he took these F1 generation plants and he pollinated them against one another. And here is where something really strange happened. When he crossed the purple against the purple from the F1 generation, what he saw was about 75% of the offspring having purple flowers and 25% of the offspring having white flowers. Now, this is really strange because let's imagine for a moment that somehow the theory of blended inheritance was true. You see, what I imagine when we think about blending are things like colors or of a paint blending together. Because if I had purple paint and white paint blend together, I would get something like lavender. But in order for that to separate again into the pure purple and white that I started off with, well, that would be really difficult. So observing this ratio and using his knowledge of probability and statistics, which he was really good at, he started to think deeply and developed a theory that would become true to this day. Now, the theory he develops would be called the theory of particulate inheritance, and that requires some explaining because the word particulate to me sounds like discrete things, actual materials that instead of blending like gases or liquids would remain solid, something like marble. And here is how Mendel would describe his theory of particulate inheritance with respect to the results that he saw. First, he explained that every individual has two particulates that contribute to a particular character. Now, the law that he would develop that would drive this explanation is called the law of segregation, that the particulates will randomly segregate before being passed on to the next generation. So, for example, if you had a purple flower, the purple plant with two purple particulates would have no choice but to pass on its purple, and the white flower plant would have no choice but to pass on its white particulate because they had two copies of the same particulate. However, in the F1 generation, each of the offspring plant would have received one purple and one white particulate, resulting in having both the purple and the white particulate. However, these plants were purple, and this is where Mendel would introduce his theory of dominance, stating that in many cases, one of the two particulates may dominate the other in its expression as a physical plant. So in this case, purple was dominant over white, meaning that even if you had both purple and white particulates, you would be expressing only the purple color. Now, that is not where he stopped, because I think the real reason that the theory of particulate inheritance was so powerful was in that 3-to-1 ratio of purples to whites that he saw in the offspring of our F1 plants. So let's remember that in statistics, the probability of two independent events occurring together is a product of the probabilities of each independent event. In other words, if you were to flip your coin twice, the chance of landing tails on both of those flips will be 50% times 50%, resulting in 25%. I want you to keep this in mind because remember that Mendel said that there was a random chance of one of the two particulates being passed on to the next generation from a parent plant. So if we look at the F1 plant with both the purple and white, each of these plants would have equal chance of passing on either a purple particulate or a white particulate to the next generation. And that would also be true to the other plant to which it is being mated. So in this scenario, here's what we have. We have 50% chance of purple from one plant, 50% chance of purple from the other plant, resulting in 25% of the offspring having two purple particulates. Now, this would also be true for purple and white and purple, leading to another 25% and another 25% for whites and purples and white particulates in those offspring respectively. And of course, the last one would be to have a white particulate and a white particulate in the next generation, which would roughly be 25%. Now, referring back to the law of dominance, what we see here is that roughly 50% of the offspring should have the purple and white, and 25% should have purple and purple. And because the law of dominance states that purple would dominate over the white in its expression, we had roughly 75% of the plants who would appear to be purple and 25% of the plants who would appear to be white. And this is the brilliance of Mendel. He was able to use probabilities and mathematics to explain a real-world phenomena and develop a theory of particulate inheritance that we in 2023 understand as the inheritance of chromosomes, because the particulates that Mendel was talking about are the alleles on the locus of that particular character within a chromosome that does in fact segregate during meiosis and is randomly distributed into our gamete cells, whether it be sperm or eggs, which again has a random probability of meeting together. And he was able to do this before any of the modern synthesis of DNA, chromosomes, or even meiosis was on the table, which is why I believe that Mendel was such a genius. Now, there is one more law that Mendel talks about, which requires our analysis of two loci simultaneously. That is to say, when we're tracking two genes simultaneously through our analysis, and that is the law of independent assortment. But we're going to save that for another video, because today I just want to sort of talk to you guys about what Mendel did and why we consider Mendel to be such a brilliant scientist. But until next time, have a great day, and we'll see you guys very soon.